Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. Thank you all, our participants and audience, for joining us for this next session on trans and non-binary cultures and histories. The moderator for this session will be Professor Jennifer Breyer. She is professor of gender and women's studies and also of history, and director of the Gender and Women's Studies program. Their research and teaching are largely focused on exploring the historical interests of gender, race, and sexuality. She is author of the book Infectious Ideas: U.S. Political Response to the AIDS Crisis. And she has curated exhibitions and public history projects, including the award-winning exhibition out in Chicago at the Chicago History Museum. And this exhibition, I will say, was just so groundbreaking and world-altering that people continue to talk about it to this very day. In fact, over a dinner conversation last night, people were talking about the life-altering quality of that exhibition, Jenny. So, still thanking you so much for that. She is project director of History Moves, a mobile project that presents underexplored aspects of Chicago history. Thank you, Jenny, for joining us.
That's very kind of you. I really appreciate those words. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here this morning. I'm sorry I missed the morning session, which sounded like it was quite incredible. I'm going to watch it on video. I'm going to watch the tape, as we used to say. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. And for this panel called Trans and Non-Binary Cultures and Histories. I know some of them. I know some of them by person and some of them by word. And so I'm excited to be together today. Our first speaker is Erica Chu, professor at Harry S. Truman College in English. And more importantly, one of our most beloved and missed lecturers in UIC in Gender and Women's Studies. Erica Chu is at Truman College in the uptown neighborhood of Chicago. They are a recent PhD from Loyola University Chicago and a former visiting lecturer at UIC in Gender Women's Studies and the English department. Some of their work appears in Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, a resource for transgender community, A/B, auto/biography studies, difficult subjects, insights and strategies for teaching about race, sexuality, gender and asexualities, feminist and queer perspectives. Erica, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so my presentation today is called On Harry Harriet Becoming Harriet, Looking for Non-Binary Identity in Cliff's No Telephone to Heaven. Since our discussion will be so centered on characters from a novel, here's a brief overview of the book for those of you who haven't read it or haven't talked about it in a while. This 1987 novel traces the story of Claire, a mixed-race Jamaican woman who moves around the world trying to find her place, community, and purpose, and who ultimately returns to participate in decolonial and anti-colonial work in Jamaica. Harry Harriet is a friend, lover, confidant, and decolonial mentor to Claire. Harry Harriet is also a co-conspirator with Claire and others in the violent and anti-colonial action that ends the book. Most of the novel portrays Harry Harriet as a multi-gendered or non-binary type person, but in the final sections, it's clear that, quote, Harriet live and Harry be no more. Before continuing, I want to make a note of my language when talking about Harriet. On this slide, you can see some of the information readers get about the character in the novel. When I address the character as a whole, I use Harriet and she pronouns. But through most of the novel, the narrator calls the character Harry Harriet and uses he pronouns. And by the end of the novel, the character only identifies as Harriet, so the narrator calls her Harriet and exclusively uses she pronouns. I'll follow the conventions of naming and pronoun use from the narrator. I do want to acknowledge, though, that among gender variant people in the US today, the most commonly accepted convention for talking about a person before a name or pronoun change is to default to their current name and pronouns, even when speaking about them in the past. Harriet does not seem to follow this convention, though. For instance, the narrator refers to her childhood as, quote, her boyhood, end quote. My presentation today comes from a larger piece in which I argue that the character to forms of gender and sexual variance rooted in West African cultural heritage, and that their journeys to disrupt their investment in colonial epistemologies result in affirming their whole complex identities. The primary focus of that work is on Claire's experience, since she is so often misunderstood as hiding her queerness. But today I want to explore Harriet, a character widely recognized as a queer model in the novel. Many critics label Harriet various terms such as homosexual, bisexual, queer, transgendered, transgender, trans, transsexual, transvestite, and crossdresser. These are all testaments to the shifting language and understanding in critical conversations about gender and sexuality in English. And today we could easily add non-binary for what makes sense in the gender vernacular of the moment. But all these terms, including non-binary, are also only approximations of Harriet's identity, because her journey is also one moving toward the embrace of ancestral knowledge rooted in West African cultures that precede the English language and its conceptual limitations. In addition, Harriet's gender identity, as is anyone's, is wrapped up in so much more than her gender. When I first read No Telephone to Heaven some years ago, I recall being saddened by Harriet's ultimate decision to make a choice. As a mixed-race Asian American queer and non-binary person who fought through Christian-dominated cultures to make some kind of life for myself, I resented being put in the position to have to make a choice about my identity, especially for the sake of others. And reading the end of No Telephone to Heaven felt like a letdown. Harriet, the dynamic, sometimes more male, sometimes more female figure full of flamboyance, energy, jokes, and whims, became a more reserved person who feels a duty to help people who might hate or even kill her if they knew her history. I wanted Harriet to stay multi-gendered and ambiguous and not feel pressured to make a choice one way or the other. But Harriet tells Claire early on, the time will come for both of us to choose, for we all have to make the choice, cast our lot. Can't live split, not in this world. In the last 40 pages of the novel, she makes her choice and becomes Harriet and emphasizes the point. The choice is mine, is made. Harriet live, and Harry be no more. In my view, at the time, the ending of the novel communicated that serving others could lead one to deny one's multifaceted identity in exchange for something more palatable to those around. I wasn't the only one with this thought. Several critics have also assumed that Harriet's choice to pass as a woman rather than a multi-gendered or more non-binary person is a sacrifice she makes in order to continue her work among the poor. In the years since that first reading, I've come to understand a lot more about non-binary identities, about Harriet, about this novel, and about the larger point the novel is making through Harriet's gender identity. For one thing, non-binary identities, like all gender identities, don't have to be permanent. If at the end of the novel Harriet is a binary woman, that's absolutely legitimate. But I don't think that that's the whole story in this case. After Harriet becomes Harriet, she studies healing practices with older women in the Jamaican countryside. An older woman calls her, quote, Maulisa, moon and sun, female, male, deity of some of their ancestors, end quote. Even after identifying only as Harriet, the old woman recognizes Harriet not just as moon, but sun and moon. The old woman affirms Harriet within a creolized gender system tied directly to Fawn and Ewe culture and religion from the Dahomey Kingdom. Like some indigenous gender and sexually variant roles, such as the native Hawaiian Mahu, Samoan Fa'afafine, Navajo or Dene, Nadlihi, and Zapotec Mushes, Harriet's gender is a multifaceted role, defined through epistemologies rooted in ancestral knowledge, passed from generation to generation. Harriet doesn't go into a lot of detail labeling or even describing her gender identity, so labeling her as non-binary or as transgender is merely an approximation. It would be more accurate to say she is sun and moon, which is a term she uses before and after asserting her identity as Harriet. In this sense, Harriet passing as a woman is a choice, but it's not a choice that prohibits her being both sun and moon. But beyond the question of whether or not Harriet is a kind of binary or non binary transgender identity, is the question of why does she have to make a choice? What does this quote we looked at earlier really mean? Answering that question requires rejecting a focus on gender alone, as if gender could ever exist alone outside culture, place, and colonial history anyway. In many indigenous cultures, including some of those recorded in parts of West Africa, gender variant people are considered lucky, are given special honor, perform ceremonies, or are healers, all of which benefit the community. Through notes in the novel's glossary, Cliff makes a clear connection between Harriet as a healer and pre-slavery West African cultures. So Harriet, the doctress, who works in the hospital by day and afterwards provides healing and medicine to the city's poor, conforms to a healing tradition that benefits the community with whom she now serves. But she also claims a gender role that affirms the West African descended and gender variant identities her Eurocentric associations had taught her were deserving of scorn. Through reclaiming a gender rooted in West African ancestral knowledge, Harriet claims association with a community with common ancestral and anti-colonial investments. By the end of the novel, when Harriet and Claire work as healers and teachers and fighters, their intended decolonial work invests in a future where homophobia and transphobia do not exist in Jamaica, because access to colonial subjugated African, indigenous, and creolized knowledge systems are restored. But that decolonial future has not come yet, since the risk of gender violence is still present at the end of the novel. By turning to ancestral systems of knowledge and conforming to traditions of healing, Harriet loves and invests in the poor, the oppressed, or the term the novel uses, the sufferers, because they are the people with whom she is allied to revive the tradition of colonial resistance. Her turn toward this decolonial self follows the tradition of the Maroons, who leave behind the hierarchies of colonial logics and build a community of African, indigenous, and mixed-race people that together fights against colonization and for survival. When Harriet tells Claire early on, the time will come for us both to choose, for we will have to make the choice, cast our lot, can live split, not in this world. Readers might read Harriet's choice as related to gender identity, but Cliff uses identity in conjunction with identification with a group. It's about who you are, but also with whom you stand. So when Harriet picks up arms in anti-colonial action, her choice is clear. When Harriet walks in the jungle to heal the sick and provide care and comfort, her choice is clear. She stands with the sufferers. But that is the choice that must be made. Can live split, not in this world. Or there is no standing on the sidelines, not when colonial oppression exists. Addressing US and Canadian Indigenous contexts, Coley Driscoll's defines decolonization as, quote, ongoing radical resistance against colonialism that includes struggles for land redress, self-determination, healing historical trauma, cultural continuance, and reconciliation, end quote. So Harriet's decolonial work includes separating herself from toxic European invested communities and connecting with others who share her values and are willing to exert their labor and risk their lives to fight against colonization. It also involves studying healing arts and serving the poor. It involves finding herself in her love for Claire and in adopting a gender role that is tied to ancestral knowledge and cultural continuance. In this sense, Harriet's choice benefits all of who she is, not just the part that is gender and sexually variant, but the part of her that is also an inheritor of colonial trauma. As has been the case in a lot of scholarship focused on Harriet, attending only to her status as queer, trans, or non-binary risks leaving out her experience under colonization, which has made ancestral knowledge systems about gender and sexuality less accessible. So, no, Harriet's choice to pass as a woman, despite being sun and moon, is not the prioritization of political goals at the expense of personal ones. Instead, Harriet makes her choices to support her whole self, not just the identities that make the most sense to scholars invested in queer theory. No Telephone to Heaven is rooted in the Caribbean rather than the indigenous context of the US and Canada that Driscoll describes. Still, a model of indigenous decolonization is especially useful in analyzing Anglophone Caribbean literature because of the displacement of the indigenous, Aboriginal, or Amerindian in what Melanie J. Newton calls Anglophone Caribbean indigenism. Erasure of not only pre-colonial indigenous cultures in the Americas, but also pre-slavery African cultures is too common. So in a literary and critical landscape where indigenous history and knowledge systems are displaced by a focus on racialized cultural criticism alone, it is useful to explore not only the roles of Black Caribbean knowledge systems created out of creolized culture, but also ancestral connection to Aboriginal American and African knowledge systems. By discussing connection to ancestral knowledge systems as decolonial, I am not suggesting that pre-colonial knowledge systems are more appropriate for those living under colonization. Neither am I suggesting that Cliff's work strives for indigenous or African or even Caribbean cultural purity. Rather, I am suggesting that for those whose history, culture, and knowledge systems have been suppressed by colonization and often replaced with colonial logics, looking to ancestral knowledge is a tool for developing decolonial knowledge systems that, following Driscoll's definition of decolonization, aid in cultural continuance, self-determination, healing from colonial trauma, and redressing colonial harm. For those of us invested in queer and trans studies today, Cliff's novel is a reminder to rethink our starting point for theorizing academic knowledge in general, and our starting point for theorizing gender and sexual variance in particular. Like Harriet, whose investment in these questions spurs her on to increasing anti-colonial action, our disciplinary and personal journeys will lead us to new alliances, new accomplishments, and new dangers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was really wonderful. Our next speaker is Leah Devon, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers, my alma mater. Devon's research focuses on the history of gender, sexuality, science, and medicine in pre-modern Europe, as well as on contemporary queer and trans studies. We are the author of The Shape of Sex, Non-Binary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance, published by Columbia University Press just this year. Congratulations. And articles in GLQ, WSQ, Osiris, and Radical History Review. Devon is also co-editor of a special issue of TSQ, Trans Historicities, which came out from Duke in 2018.
Thanks so much, and thanks to the organizers, and also thanks to the wonderful panelists in the panel before ours, and thanks to Erica too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, is that showing for people? Great. Okay, so I just want to start by saying that I think it's a collective assumption among not just the general public, but also among members of the queer, trans, non-binary community. And I'm just going to use Twitter here for a moment as kind of a stand-in for collective assumptions, although I think someone accurately described it as kind of a nightmare scape before. But here, just a kind of a sampler. And I think it represents a sort of this collective assumption that the emergence of non-binary gender categories, the sort of debates that surround them, the term non-binary itself, that this is all new. That this has all happened in very recent years. 1990s are cited in a couple of these tweets, and that when we use non-binary to describe past individuals or past gendered concepts about them, that we're using an anachronism. So part of what I try to do in my current research is to put the discussions that we're having about non-binary gender practices, non-binary embodiment into a much longer historical framework. And in doing so, to show that the concept and vocabulary of non-binary gender, it actually turns out not to be so new after all. So my recently published book looks at sex and gender variants in Europe going all the way back to the ancient world. It covers the years from about 200 to 1400. And although I think of my book as a part of transgender history and a part of intersex history, I do use the language of non-binary because it preserves the actual vocabulary that pre-modern people used to describe individuals and to talk about their own societal organization of sex and gender in that time period. So I'm just going to give you one quick example. We can see here, this is from a notarial summary all the way back from the 13th century. It's by this guy Rolandino. You can see him over here. Looks a little doubtful, but he uses the word non-binary in Latin. He uses bimembrum to describe the assimilation of a person who is outside the binary into a binary legal category. So this language is language that was used all the way back at least as early as the 13th century. And hence, I think that we can let go of this fear of anachronism about the language and conceptual framework of non-binarity to describe systems of categorization before the 1990s. And indeed, we can use it to go all the way back to a pre-modern framework. So of course, though, when we use this language about non-binary gender and non-binary sex to describe these past categories, of course, we're using terms that are legible to people today, that give us common concepts that are familiar, that allow us to be able to characterize unfamiliar phenomena. But we do also have to be attentive to the way that this language, of course, shifts over time. And when we use it, to be attentive to how we might potentially erase some of the specificity of historical periods that come before. So what I want to do for the rest of my talk is give a couple examples of the way that non-binary sex and gender are used specifically in a historical context, and then think a little bit about what that might mean for us in the present. Okay, so let me start with this. So on the one hand, the history of pre-modern Europe that I study provides us with plenty of evidence of efforts to police or exclude those who are perceived to be non-binary, and accusations that someone was both male and female at the same time, or neither male nor female. These were accusations that were certainly mobilized to harm individuals and communities. A great deal of my research centers on how, during the pre-modern period, and particularly during the period between the 12th and the 14th century, during a period of Holy Christian War and a period of anti-Jewish violence in Europe, Christian Europeans used the charge that an individual or a community was somehow outside of binary categories of maleness or femaleness. And they used that accusation to stigmatize particularly Jewish and Muslim communities, and also to dehumanize populations in Africa and Asia. So I'm just going to give two quick images here. This first one comes from a world map that was produced in England just after the years of 1300. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but just to note that on the map, over in the edge of the, what's perceived to be kind of the edge of the world to the English creators of the map, there is an area that's labeled as Africa and Ethiopia in particular. And in that area are a number of kind of dubiously human or subhuman characters that include one that is described and pictured as combining male and female traits, and is part of a larger discourse that imagines that people in Africa or Asia on these maps switched back and forth between male and female gendered positions and sexual positions. So a sort of imagining of non-binary gender as being something that existed outside of Europe, particularly in Africa and Asia, and in so labeling those areas, also associating them with a kind of image of monstrosity, non-humanness, and otherness. This is all, I should say, in the context again of Christian Holy War, and these maps and texts are produced in a kind of crusading propaganda context. This is another image of the world. This is the Mara Historiara Map. It's a 14th century text. It's a 15th century copy. But here, this is reproducing what it imagines to be the 3 continents of the world. So we've got Europe over here on the right, and Europe's divided by this like V-shaped river from what are Africa and Asia over here on the left. And we can see that the map is portraying these Europeans as clothed, as civilized in a sense, as clearly distinguishable as male and female through their dress, while depicting peoples in Africa and Asia as members again of these sort of mythical, what are called the monstrous races, but sort of dubiously human peoples who had strange bodies, who were imagined to exist outside of Europe, and who took part in lots of transgressive kind of cultural activities. And this includes a non-binary gendered group here. So you can see they've kind of like half male, half female, split in this kind of bifurcated way. And again, imagine to switch back and forth between male and female gender. Okay, well, all this goes to say that this sort of rhetoric, which was put in place to establish racial and geographic hierarchies, was also used to justify violence against communities, to rationalize also their removal from territories that Christians claimed as their own territory. And this history of violence and expulsion, of course, resonates with the history of colonialism that we've been talking about, that then postdates this period as well. But non-binary gender and sex aren't represented only in the pre-modern period as sort of something outside, something to be corrected, something to be erased, or treated with violence. One of the reasons that I chose to study pre-modern Europe, in part, is because I wanted to intervene in transphobic and homophobic discourse in the place that people often presume that originates, that is in early Christianity. Conservative Christians now still often hold up the biblical story of Adam and Eve as evidence that God intended humans just to come in 2 types, right, in male and female sex. But not all past authorities read the Bible or interpreted Christianity in this way. So let me just give a couple more quick examples. So all the way in the beginning of early Christianity, some Christian authorities and some other early texts that were circulating in early Christianity, to imagine that what these texts said was that God actually created the first human being as what they called androgynous, or androgens, Greek for man, woman, an undifferentiated sex that only later gets split into binary sexed males and females. So to these thinkers, the original and intended state of humanity, as God created humans, was a combination of, or sometimes a negation of, binary gendered and sexed male and female traits. So by this argument, the original intended state of humanity was non-binary. So of course, this doesn't become the orthodox interpretation of Genesis, but people do keep repeating this theory and this idea over and over again for roughly 1,000 years. We can find people bringing up this kind of androgynous idea of creation. And we can find a number of examples in visual art that seem to uphold the idea that people kept coming back to this non-binary interpretation. So from the 8th century on, we find iconographical images of Adam and Eve that are depicted with the 2 of them looking almost like symmetrical or undifferentiated in their forms, kind of emphasizing this lack of binary difference. Or here, and this is a 12th century copy of a commentary on the biblical book of Genesis. And here, Adam and Eve, and you can see their names are labeled here, Adam and Eve, are represented as this single figure that's kind of like male and female combined in this Y-shaped composition. It's kind of like 2 torsos, but then like 1 lower body. This was actually a pretty prevalent way of depicting so-called androgyny, or what people called during the time period hermaphroditism. Of course, hermaphrodite's a derogatory term that people don't use in the 21st century, but it was a word that people used at the time to represent a combination of male and female traits. So you can see here, these are just, again, from pre-modern images that imagine what non-binary sex or gender might be like. So this is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So this is depicting the fusion of male and female together in a figure that's called a hermaphrodite. Again, this sort of same composition of this Y shape. And then same over here, this is another androgynous figure that has this similar iconography. So this image of Adam and Eve is really drawing on a visually comprehensible imagery associated with non-binary sex and gender. And finally, a similar trope appears in later Christian interpretations of the so-called Jesus hermaphrodite. So this is a way in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance of depicting Jesus Christ as being a combination or a balance of male and female physical and gendered traits. And in these kinds of texts, transcending or erasing binary models of sex and gender is represented as a positive, as a transformative way for people to affect a physical and spiritual transformation and transcendence of their world. So I know I'm giving a very quick overview of these images here, and I'd be happy to talk more in Q&A. Oh, and I should also say that one of the ways that non-binary gender and that gender is depicted here is in terms of the sun and the moon. So these are sun-moon images that combine male and female. I think that's a really interesting resonance with what Erica just said. So anyways, these images go to one of the main points of my research, which is to say that the preference for binarism, that is the idea that, only male and female are legitimate, they're the only natural ways of being, the only desirable ways of being, that this is something that is a historically situated phenomena, and it changes over time, and it's not a natural then or a historical unchanging kind of division of humankind. So, we've been talking a lot about our contemporary lives and contemporary activism and kind of where we are and what we want to see in the world now. So, I know some people might be thinking, like, what am I looking at here? This happened a really long time ago, and it's pretty far removed from us in place and cultural context. But this is part of why I think it's really important. The fact that we can go this far back into the distant past, and that we can see that non-binary gendered ideas and practices exist, and that some of them anticipate some of the ideas that we have and some of the assumptions that we make even in the 21st century, I think is extremely powerful. These points of resonance that we can find across time show us and give real substantial evidence that non-binary bodies, that non-binary gender practices, these have existed for centuries, for millennia even. And although we don't need history to legitimate non-binary lives now, I think we have to be realistic that history is seen as a legitimating force, and that frequently we see claims being made that if a community has a history, that means that they have a place in the present, that means they should have a place in the future. So creating these expanded timelines of non-binary gender, I think are really crucial as a point of political activism, as well as kind of expanding our intellectual and historical worlds. But the other point I want to make is it's not just where we see similarities that are important, because sometimes when we look back at the past, it's just like super weird. It's different, it's confusing, it can be like unsettling. And I think that unsettling, that disorients us and lets us like not be sure of what we know, helps us to really grasp that there are a lot of different possibilities out there, radically different possibilities from our own in organizing our world, in organizing sex and gender, and organizing hierarchies of peoples. And I think that in this unsettling, we can get out of where we are and start to think about what kind of radically different worlds we might want to imagine for ourselves in the present and the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. there are lots of threads that are starting to be spun. So I encourage people to think about questions as we go through the rest of the panelists. Our next panelist is Lucy Nicholas. Lucy's research specializes in gender and sexual diversity, social and political theory, queer theory, whiteness, and feminisms. Their first book, Queer Post-Gender Ethics, was published in 2014 by Palgrave Macmillan, and their second book, The Persistence of Global Masculinisms, co-authored with Chris Agius, was published in 2018. Their PhD was awarded at University of Edinburgh, where they worked before moving to the University of Portsmouth and then to Australia. They were awarded an Australian Office of Learning and Teaching citation for outstanding contributions to student learning in 2015. Lucy.
Thank you so much for that intro. The reason I am so distracted is I have a wild puppy who just levered my chair down. So all sorts of excitement could happen during this 15 minutes. It probably would be more interesting for you to just watch the puppy play for 15 minutes. But anyway, thank you for my intro. And thank you everyone so far. Like, this has been such an inspiring morning already. And I say morning because it's 3:52 a.m. here. So I reckon I win some kind of award for like most difficult time zone. But
hopefully you took a disco nap at some point.
Pardon?
Hopefully you took a disco nap at some point.
Don't tell I did. So thank you for having me. I want to share my slides. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in so-called Australia. And I want to acknowledge the Indigenous elders past and present who were custodians of the land here for hundreds of thousands of years. And I want to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on Three Fires land as well. So I guess today, I wish in a way that the first panel could have just gone all day. And so I'll try and see this brief moment as me kind of offering resources to think through some of those things that have been articulated so well already this morning by all of the panelists. Because what I'm really interested in at the moment, in particular in my research, is some of the polemical, like binary oppositions that have emerged in politics and identity, and how there's actually a whole bunch of historical, both recent and much less recent, historical resources that can help us think through some of those polemics and oppositions. So I will move on. So I guess I'm going to start with this moment of me looking for resources myself when I was doing my PhD a very, very long time ago. And talking about age and being elders in the previous session was really interesting to me because I didn't have non-binary elders to look up to. And had to find things myself, these kind of ideas about getting rid of gender that I was really interested in. I couldn't find anyone writing or talking about that. And I found this kind of moment in the 1970s where like white Anglo feminists were talking about getting rid of gender as a very feminist thing to do. That was the ultimate aim for feminism, and that, you know, gender is the thing that's holding us all back and creating the hierarchy in the first place. So here I've quoted Wittig, and listed a bunch of books that I found so inspirational, kind of speculative fiction of the 1970s, imagining these differently gendered or non-gendered futures, some of which I had to like search far and wide for. There's one in the middle is a collection of short stories I highly recommend. But I think what's really interesting is that things that used to be fairly uncontroversial to say in feminism, like, yeah, we should get rid of gender, have now become massive sticking points of polarization and debate. And I want to look back at different ways of thinking that can help us think beyond these oppositions and see how fruitless they are, I suppose. So one of those looking backs I want to do is looking back at feminists from the 20th century who I sometimes think are neglected or misinterpreted. And I also want to draw on some of the indigenous knowledge systems that I think well, partly that Erica has already talked about actually, but Indigenous knowledge systems, not so much from a perspective of looking at identities that can be called non-binary or like attributed as non-binary from here looking backwards, but rather knowledge systems in terms of how we see the world and how we can see the world in less binary ways. So I guess I've got this massive list of horrible divides that have developed through academia and activism through the last, I don't know, since the 80s. But I guess the things that I think underpins a bunch of these divides is this positioning. Sorry, my dog just did the thing again and my chair went down. It's quite remarkable. This idea of looking for foundations and identities and unity to cohere around, that I think is a pretty wrong-headed way of approaching things. And again, this is something that Erica was talking about before in terms of moving forward with politics and gender politics. So I'm very interested then in how do we get beyond the rigid position that we're in now, where some feminists are claiming that getting rid of the concept of sex assigned at birth will undermine feminist gains. And that really speaks back to some of the things that were talked about this morning. So Saeed was talking about moving away from, I'm looking at my notes, moving away from gender as a meaningful social category, like all of these 70s feminists were talking about, but in a tangible way, in a way that doesn't undermine feminist aims. So I think there's just so many resources, academic, political, and so on, that can help us to do that and think about that. Also, Jenny, please would you give me a warning when I've spoken for too long? Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I think I really like this quote, and it's academic bingo. I've used a Foucault quote, so everyone gets to do a shot or something. But I really like the way that Foucault thinks beyond polemicism. And I like this quote where he says, the polemicist proceeds encased in privileges that he possesses in advance and will never agree to question. On principle, he possesses rights authorizing him to wage war and making that struggle a just undertaking. The person he confronts is not a partner in search for the truth, but an adversary, an enemy who's wrong, who's harmful, and whose very existence constitutes a threat. For him, then, the game consists not of recognizing this person as a subject having the right to speak, but of abolishing him as an interlocutor. I've never said that out loud, lack of cultural capital there, from any possible dialogue. And his final objective will be not to come as close as possible to a difficult truth, but to bring about the triumph of the just cause he has been manifestly upholding from the beginning. I love this because I think it really demonstrates the kind of masculinism at the root of oppositional ways of interacting and working through problems that I think Indigenous and feminist thought can help us see past. So I want to draw on Indigenous thought then, not in an extractive way, and I don't want to talk about Indigenous thought in the old like nativizing way of like, well, this pure past when people had non-binary modes of thought or non-binary genders, but I want to kind of follow the call of native scholars Arvin Tuck and Morrill, who talk about non-native identified scholars applying native theory to settle a colonial culture. And I want to take inspiration from Indigenous modes of thought. So I'm using a couple of Australian Indigenous scholars here, queer non-binary Indigenous scholars who really caution against using the claim that other cultures have been doing this successfully years as a justification for now making claims for non-binary, and then using, so these people are both called Maddie, which I think is interesting, Maddie Clark and Maddie Day. So Maddie Day talks about pre-colonial gender diversity not being used to validate the existence of trans settlers. So just with that caveat, I do think there's some really interesting ideas to be inspired by from Indigenous thinkers, because I think that we can talk about how the perspective of those outside of dominant narratives, like the straight world, the white world, the male economy of discourses, whatever you want to call it, has long demonstrated the capacity for code switching, for being in two subject positions at once, all those things that get talked about so much. And I really like the way that Torres Strait Islander scholar Martin Nakata talks about working two knowledge systems together. And I think this idea of working two knowledge systems together really talks to what Said was saying about a tangible politics, a tangible way of looking to a utopian future whilst not chucking out the material and the everyday and the world we live in now. And I too drew on Crowley Driscoll, whose double weaving metaphor I think is really helpful to thinking about a non-binary framework. So again, Said and RJ both talked this morning about non-binary as a perspective, as a framework rather than an identity, or RJ called it a lens. And I think this is a really useful example of how people who have been outside of dominant narratives have had to think through this kind of lens and framework, a non-binary lens. So Driscoll's use of the Cherokee concept of double weaving allows us to think of politics that both utilizes and moves outside the metaphor of intersectional politics. And I do think that we increasingly see the way that intersectionality is applied, especially in like corporate settings, is an additive identity approach. And I think that these non-binary frames allow us to move beyond the kind of reductionist way that intersectionality gets applied so much these days, sadly. My slides have too much content, I'm not going to lie, so I'm going to move on and tell you that this metaphor of double weaving is super interesting, but I like the term doubling that Driscoll uses, and the idea that numerous theoretical splints can be double woven together. I just think it's just like beautiful and like inspiring. So weirdly, just jumping to 1949 now, I think I would tie this better together if I was writing, but I think I want to talk about the way that contemporary oppositional debate gets set up as either or, that we don't have to think in either ors, we can think in both ends. And I feel like people on the ground, members of the community, the non-binary community, talk like this all the time. I'm not saying anything new, but I'm relating it to scholarship. And I think that those feminist arguments against non-binary and trans feminism forget some of their feminist history, their white feminist history specifically. So those kind of white arguments against transness and non-binary forget their own white feminist history that's actually already done a lot of work of challenging itself. So I often think about Simone De Beauvoir's work, that she's between the waves. She's not first wave, she's not second wave. Writing in 1949, she often gets called an omission or a philosopher manqué. And the thing about Simone De Beauvoir's work is that she has this super complex idea of what the human is, that is neither essentialist or anti-essentialist, that is material and cultural, and is just incredible, thoughtful, intersectional. She always worked with other subordinated or minoritized groups and saw the connected struggle between feminism and those other things. She talked about sex assigned at birth as developmental, as profoundly affected by the environment. And ultimately, I read her as talking about a post-gender vision of arguing for both men and women to become a sensitive self, not as she's often read as arguing for women to become like men, that's what a lot of people charge her with, but arguing for both men and women to become a sensitive self. So for a better picture of humanity, right, of like humans being nice folks, regardless of sex assigned at birth. And I think she's also strategic in her thinking. So her politics is not either or either. So her vision of human selves, of ontology, is not either or, and her politics is not either or. Her politics is fundamentally sensitive to both means and ends. She never reduces to either side. She's got utopian vision while sitting with the material reality of the world in a way that is so helpful for looking at how people can think beyond both. And this essay, Moral Idealism and Political Realism, is like an incredible study in thinking beyond binaries. So I'm going to skip like a bunch of slides about, random second wave feminists being reread, to move, I guess, to what this all means for politics and for what I think that all of these threads can be brought together in a really interesting way to talk about a politics that's not built on identity but is built on a framework. And again, I'm not saying anything new. I'm I'm just drawing together these things to show that we need to revive them, to remember in this moment in politics, in gender politics, that there are ways to think beyond the horrible polemics that we see playing out in the hellscape of Twitter. That's come up 3 times now. That should be bingo too. So there's a lot of incredible work out there, both historically. I'm saying historically because it was last century, from the 90s. You've got Cathy Cohen talking about coalition politics, which again speaks so well to what Erica was discussing in their paper, that we don't need to think about, we don't need to have these arguments about ontology, about the nature of sex. We need to think about outcome, and we need to think about what Cathy calls, Cathy, like she's my best friend, calls a relation to power and not some homogenized identity. And that's how we should choose our political comrades. And then I think Zain Marib's work is just incredible, talking about, as a queer Indigenous person, talking about sovereignty as the ultimate principle. And I just love the idea that we would unite around outcome, politics, ethos, rather than foundations of identity, which is just the divisive, unhelpful foundation for any kind of liberation politics. So I'm going to read you this quote from Marib, who says, "Queer Indigenous political thought contributes to a different form of coalitional activism altogether, one that's not based on dissolving many different groups into a unified whole, but rather a shared mobilization that creates spaces and actions that hold, sustain, and educate about the differences that comprise the coalition as a core feature of the mobilization." I will leave you with that. I will stop my dog chewing my chair. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was terrific. Lucy, could you stop sharing your screen? Thank you so much. Our final presenter is my dear colleague and friend, Gayatri Reddy. Gayatri is Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Anthropology, Poochie, and earned her PhD in anthropology from Emory in 2001. She is author of the most wonderful book, With Respect to Sex, Negotiating Hijra Identity in South India. She has lots of new research. This new research that's in the bio was funded by the Social Science Research Council, is a project entitled Queer Borders, Constructions of South Asian male Queer Identities in the US. She has also held fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Association for Women in Science, and the National Science Foundation. And she is going to leave us somewhat early today to go be on television on our local public television station to talk about a project that she and Anna Guevara have been working on called Displacements, about Uptown, a neighborhood in Chicago. Gayatri.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I want to echo everybody's thank. Can everybody hear me? Thanks. Thank you to the organizers of this conference, to Mark Canuel, JT Turner, Nick Weststrate, everyone at the Institute for the Humanities, including Linda Vavra, all the other invisible labor that made it possible to organize this event. I also just want to say I love that this conference began with and centered community and student voices. Thank you for that intentionality. That said, as a boring-ass academic professor, I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here and to engage in conversation with all of you. And I also just want to say thank you to all my fellow panelists for your really amazing and thought-provoking presentations today. So again, thank you, Jenny, for that generous introduction. Jenny is the chair of my department and a beloved friend and interlocutor of many years here. My talk today is based, as Jenny said, on my earlier work with a specific community that many of you are probably familiar with, Hijras in India. that resulted in the book that Jenny just mentioned, that for better or for worse, played a role in the landmark Supreme Court case in India, Nalsa versus Union of India in 2014, that gave Hijras the right to self-identification of their gender and some access to public resources, warts and all. So I began this work about 25 years ago in the South Indian city of Hyderabad. I'm dating myself here, definitely not a Gen Xer here. And sadly, I just want to note that almost all the Hijras I was closest to and worked with have passed on, precisely because of the precarity of their lives and the fact that even today, as JT alluded to at the start of the conference, even as we've made huge strides in recognizing the quote unquote gifts and treasures in RJ's terms from this morning that trans, non-binary lives are in the world, for moving to a place where gender can be casual, as Jake articulated it this morning, we still live in a society that is fundamentally anti-trans, anti-racist, anti-Dalit, and Islamophobic in India, and in the context of this conversation, fraught for non-binary bodies and experiences. So as most of you know, here at least know today, Hijras are often seen as the quintessential, quote-unquote, third sex of India, the most frequently encountered figures in the narrative linking of India with gendered and sexual difference, often being seen as the quote-unquote indigenous transgender category and community in India. Today, I want to trouble this easy understanding of Indian sexual and gender difference. I do so by placing this characterization of Hijras in historical context, problematizing both the primacy of this figure and the ideological frames through which Hijras have been characterized in the 15 minutes I have today. I want to make three simple and interrelated points. One, that even as we look to history and the archive to recover our past, and all of the panelists today have kind of spoken to that. Folks this morning spoke to that as well. And I'm not by any means saying history is not important, but I am merely saying that we need to problematize our attachment to archival recovery as a way to seek the truth of sexuality, right? Two, that there is a history to how Hijras came to singularly represent forms of queerness and transness in India, with Hijra voices often being silent in this story. And three, as Hijras themselves note, and as Erica and Lucy's presentations pointed out, sexuality and gender are not the only framing narratives through which, in this case, Hijras craft their subjectivity. So as such, here I trouble the sufficiency of sexual politics and gender performativity as adequate glosses on Hijra identification and practice. So diving right into the paper, sorry for that long preamble. In the opening line of Anjali Arondekar's book, For the Record, on sexuality in the colonial archive in India, she paraphrases the first question the archivist in Mumbai asks of her. What are you looking for, madam? She raises this question critically to get us to problematize the ways in which we often search the archives to find or recover objects or subjects, a search for hidden histories that then become sedimented as originary or singular difference. Even as I focus on this paper on Hijras as a way to think about categories and communities beyond the binary, I want to start with this caveat to be mindful of our desire for, as Arondekar says, reliable ghosts and discoverable pasts. I want to highlight the point Arondekar makes in her book that to reconstruct histories of sexuality or find hidden categories of transness, we often turn to the archive, and in the case of India, the colonial archive especially, without asking carefully enough how the very objects we are looking for have been shaped by these colonial archival logics themselves. As she notes, it is important to ask, quote, questions of how sexuality is made visible in the colonial archive and of how this process paradoxically discloses the very limits of that visibility, end quote. She quotes Anne Stoller, a historical anthropologist, to emphasize that too often we academics mine the content of the archive, but rarely attend to its form and context. That is to say, in our quest to recover erasures and find our histories, we are too often focused on government commissions and reports, the facts and objects that comprise the content of archives, and less so on the form or the process by which these archives were created and how they shape the questions we ask of them. Stoller calls for us to move from, quote, archive as source to archive as subject, end quote, a move Arundhakar endorses and deploys productively for the field of sexuality studies. That said, the archive is no doubt a profoundly rich source of quote-unquote data through which to understand the ways in which hijras have been configured and seen through time. I use this language intentionally because the second point I want to underline is that there is a history to how hijras came to singularly represent quote-unquote authentic forms of queerness and transness in India, and part of that story is captured in how hijras rose to prominence under colonial regimes. As Jessica Hinchey outlines in her excavation of the colonial archive on hijras, published in 2019, titled Governing Gender and Sexuality in Colonial India, the Hijra, circa 1850 to 1900, what the archive reveals is the extensive paperwork the British colonial administration generated in the form of a moral panic about the quintessentially immoral hijras, who joined the ranks of other such immoral and unruly populations in India, like lepers, female prostitutes, low caste, and itinerant communities. This moral panic and subsequent policing was intentionally generated to buttress a vision of the colonial state as a bulwark against immorality, squash any threats to colonial political authority from unruly subjects, and simultaneously do the work of condemning local Islamic empires with whom hijras were most often associated. As such, the singular focus and intense policing of hijras that resulted in an entire portion of the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act being devoted to them was not a result of anything hijras necessarily signified for local communities, but a result of the need and justification for colonial governance. As Hinchey notes, quote, issues of gender and sexuality were not just a moralizing mask for more rational and pragmatic matters of colonial administration. The anti-hijra campaign illustrates that gender expression, sexual behaviors, domestic arrangements, and intimate relationships were central to colonial governance. In fact, these matters were so germane to colonial rule that British officials demanded that the immoral hijra community be rendered extinct, end quote. In other words, the colonial policing of hijras and their subsequent hypervisibility in the archive had a lot to do with the need to assert colonial dominance and foster colonial governance, and little to do with the desires and local articulations of hijras themselves. And it is the resultant and copious, quote-unquote, eunuch archive that shaped the primacy of hijras in post-colonial India and in contemporary academic studies as the quintessential trans figure in narratives of gender and sexual difference in India. A corollary to the archival point noted above is that in this archive, and here I'm including the pre-colonial archive as well, hijras are overwhelmingly silent in these representations. Tracing the ways in which hijras have been represented reveals less about hijra lives, concerns, and desires, and more about the analytic and ideological concerns of the moment. These range from a concern with representations of ambiguity in ancient Indian texts, that is Vedic, Puranic, Jain, and Buddhist, that outlined a range of different, quote-unquote, third-natured categories, Kliba, Pandaka, Tritya Prakriti, concerned with deliberating the ambiguous differentiations between them, to medieval representations of hijras through the lens of Islam and slavery, as political actors or Muslim slaves who rose to political prominence, to colonial representations, as I just noted, through the lens of immorality and criminality, making a case for colonial governance, to modern representations as the primary, quote-unquote, third sex or gender of India in global compendia of sexual difference. This most recent incarnation created a clear demarcation between Hijra's religious and sexual practices, eventually laying the groundwork for their consolidation through development aid and the AIDS enterprise as the authentic Indian transgender native in India. This is precisely what appears to have occurred in India in the 2000s. There was an institutionalization of the category transgender, especially in state and institutional logics of development and governance, creating both an overly bounded understanding of this category as well as a deepening schism between transgender, often or only focusing on trans women, and homosexual or MSM grids of intelligibility, merely generating new forms of surveillance for marking authentic gender difference and delineating norms of legibility for one community against its class and sexual others. And as scholars have argued, such a universalization and institutionalization of transgender as an umbrella category does all kinds of disservice, potentially ignoring other epistemologies of gender sexual variance and replicating colonial modes of knowledge production, as Susan Stryker, Ani Datta, Rena Roy, and David Valentine, among others, note, while subsuming South Asian discourses and practices as merely a local expression of transgender identity. In contrast, Hijras themselves had a slightly different story to tell, which brings me to my third and final point. Hijras saw themselves and others in the sexual and gendered communities in India as composite subjects, born through kinship, the law, state surveillance, intimacy, religion, class, embodiment, and hierarchies of respect, in addition to gender and sexuality. In other words, while sexuality and gender are part of their representations of self, Hijras narrate themselves in various ways, through idioms of respect, through enactments of masti or fun, as Muslims, as sex workers, as politicians incapable of nepotism, among other framings, crafting themselves not just as part of an Indian LGBTQIA+ movement, but also within the South Asian sexual and labor economies, where celibacy, asceticism, masti, gendered forms of labor, sexual rights all have regionally specific values attached to them. One of my closest interlocutors in Hyderabad, Munira, one of the senior leaders of the group that was closest to, once said to me, "Hum asli hai, hum nakli bhi hai, hum hijre hai aur koti bhi. Main jhoot nahi bolti. Hum hijre hai, lekin humko aadmi bhi hai. Hum maa baap, bhai behan ko dekhbhal karti hu. That is, we are real and we are fake. We're hijras and kotis too. I don't tell lies. We're hijras, but we have husbands too and take care of our mothers and fathers, sisters, and brothers." In typical Hyderabadi Hindi, she then added, "Aise hi hai. Hijre izzat wale hai, lekin aur bhi hai." That is, it is like that. We are people with respect. Hijras are people with respect, but we are more too. In that opening, that ellipses, quote, but we are more too, ... Munira recognizes what it means to play with and embody plurality and ambiguity, exploring precarity and possibilities that exceed the regulatory abilities of the state and development apparatus. In households, on street corners, in courtrooms, in the marketplace, and in the everyday lives of Hijras as they navigate the shoals of quote-unquote thirdness. As Hijras themselves would say, all thirdness is indeed not alike. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. All thirdness is not alike. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to navigate some of the things that are appearing in the chat and the Q&A, and I encourage all of the panelists and attendees to post things to the Q&A function. It'll be easier for me to keep track of them. And I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to first defer to the people who have posted. I think I'm going to start with the chat because it gives a little bit of space for other people to answer. And then, Leah, you'll see that there's a specific set of questions for you in the Q&A. I find this concept of taking intersectional identities, this is from, Maximiliana. I find this concept of taking intersectional identities non-reductively very interesting insofar as we should treat identities as, in practice, interwoven with one another and not reduced to one another, as you mentioned is sometimes done at Lucy, although I would say everybody really mentions that. As someone who works on the philosophical foundations of the neuroscience and psychology of gender identity, my main question revolves around the ways in which studies on gender identity in these sciences ought to understand the very construction of gender identity vis-a-vis its relation to other salient identities. How do we preserve the ways in which these identities intercompose one another while trying to conceptually and operationally define them for individual study? And I would only add that there are a lot of different sort of scientific explorations, interdisciplinary explorations of this concept here. So Gayatri's called out history in a particular way. Erica has called out a kind of narrative strategy, and both Leah and Lucy are asking us to have an ability to engage in a kind of visual. And I think it could be a question that really speaks to everybody, and I open it up. Bye, Gayatri.
I would love to hear what other people have to say. It's such a huge question, and just so much going on there in terms of, I have so many thoughts about psychology as discipline and its treatment of gender in general, which I think makes it, when something is constituted as a science, I think it makes it hard to have complex understandings of stuff because you need to categorize stuff to measure it and so on. And somebody this morning in the panel was talking about that, about measure it. I think it was, is their name Blake? Sorry, I'm very bad at remembering at 4 a.m. But somebody on the panel this morning was talking about, the dangers and potentials of measuring non-binary students or including them in data collection, right? And we struggle with that all the time as well in Australia. So unis are like, we need to know how many people we have at the uni who are non-binary so we know what services to offer. And I'm like, well, we know they exist. We don't have to measure them yourself in your institution. But what I'm saying is by having to measure them and create a survey instrument, you're already predefining them. And I think that might be one of the issues that's going on in this question from Maximiliana. And I don't have an answer because I don't have to, because I'm a sociologist and that's what we do.
Just to add quickly to that, I study literature primarily, so we're off in La La Land. We can just talk about whatever we want. We don't actually have to talk as much about studying people. But I think the question, maybe people have talked previously about this study that came out recently from, who was it? I don't know, but it was making social media rounds, where the people who performed the study marked some non-binary as cisgender, and were just very uncareful in how they talked about it. And it was really surprising. And every kind of like trans group and non-binary group on social media was just having a fit about it. And so that would be an example of what not to do, right? Try to be more careful, try to be in community with people who have those kinds of identities and try to take clues. So I just think being more conscious of talking about it being a limitation is extremely important and can go a long way, because even if you are the most careful, I don't think that you'll ever be perfect in being able to accomplish that goal.
I'm muted now. Leah, did you want to add anything or?
Yeah, it looked like there were a couple of questions for me, but I was having a hard time reading them and also kind of keeping track with what was going on. So I don't know how we should approach.
Do you want to answer that question and then I'll go back to asking these? No.
Actually, I'll just go ahead and pass, and then because I'm trying to.
I'm sorry, it's hard.
It's so hard to keep track of the
so hard to keep track
at the same
of
time.
Yeah. Luckily, I have 8 things open on my desktop right now. So
So
anonymous.
everybody, bingo, Zoom bingo, you had mute on, and now we can't keep up with all the different tabs. Double Zoom bingo.
Oh, cool! I'm so excited. I win. I am the winner. Is Leah distinguishing between intersex and non-binary in their readings of historical images? Can they speak more about how they interpret drawings of hermaphrodite / androgynous bodies as non-binary rather than or in addition to intersex? And then the second question, which I actually think is potentially somewhat related, Reza Phillip asks, hello, thanks a lot for the inspiring talk, Leah. I was wondering while looking at the pictures what you mean exactly by the people are imagining as non-binary and gender switching. For me, especially the picture showing the 3 continents with the European on the right and clothed rather seemed like the image would be something like the cultured, civilized Europeans have a gender, whereas the other people are pre or non-cultured intersex bodies, which I think is what they were arguing. So to make my question more precise, why would a reading of the issue as a non-binary be more justified than reading it as intersex discrimination? In my view, in order to apply as a non-binary framework, you have to explain why being binary gendered in the European view is cultural achievement that the others lack, and therefore you also cannot presuppose that you can use concepts such as gender as non-binary fruitfully to make this very complex issue be understood. What do you think?
Okay. So these are great questions. And, I think part of it is that I have a 400-page book where I try to go through these different categories in very, very careful ways. And then it's just kind of hard to, to boil it down to a few minutes for a talk like this. Okay. So to answer the first question, what is the difference between intersex and non-binary? And am I conflating non-binary and intersex here? And I just want to make it clear that, in my book, I spend 100 pages going through and trying to talk about the ways that non-binary works and also shifts in meaning. And that's part of what I was trying to get at in my quick talk and saying, when we use non-binary identified people and communities in the 21st century, and when people are using the word non-binary in say the 13th or 14th century, although it's part of the umbrella of non-binary history, they're not using it in precisely the same kinds of ways that we use it now. So that's part of just it's the same thing when we talk about trans history, right? We're using these terms as an umbrella to give us an expanded view of history, but we're not trying to say that these terms are absolutely monolithic across time and that they're not variable and culturally specific, and in my case very period specific, because part of what I want to do is show that all of these terms are drastically changing, and the valuations that people are putting on them are drastically changing over time, and we're just kind of at these different snapshots as a part of showing that historical specificity and denaturalizing these categories. So one, is this about intersex? It's absolutely about intersex also. And sometimes when, I don't want to spend all this, take up too much time, but sometimes when people are talking about these so-called hermaphrodite or androgen, tribes that exist in Africa or Asia, they immediately start talking about actual intersex people in their own communities and use it to reflect on how they fit into contemporary society. So it is absolutely about intersex. But also, much of what they attribute to these androgen or hermaphrodite communities, it fits into what we might call trans or non-binary as well, in that they're attributing not just intersex embodiment to these groups, but they're talking specifically about the way that they exercise gender in a way that doesn't really match up with how we talk about intersex now, or how intersex people often identify. So it's often talking about people who are transgressing gender boundaries, acting as men in one case and acting as women in another case, or acting as neither men nor women as a part of like what the specific gender transgressions that these authorities want to attribute to places outside of Europe. And I think let's see if I can try to answer all of this, but that part of this geographical mapping of gender that is outside of like binary categories, both in terms of embodiment and in terms of gender behavior, and also I might say in terms of sexuality, because sexuality, embodiment, and gender are all kind of wrapped up in one category for this period. So even some of the assumptions we might make about ontological divides between what is sexuality, what is gender, don't really hold for this period. So that's part of what I really want to say is, when we're looking at history, we have to kind of let go of what we think we know about what is intersex, what is gender, what is sexuality, because those are not assumptions that can hold across time. People have very different ways of thinking about what all of these categories, identities, and practices mean in time. Okay, so I'm not sure I answered all of, so I think one other part of the question I wanted to say was, I think the second person said, how can you not see this as a sort of pre-culture kind of intersex bodies that haven't developed? So this kind of stadial view of development into, I think, doesn't necessarily also hold for this period, because there's not so much like an evolutionary idea of racially or in terms of like geographical and colonial context, but rather I could say here a binary of Christian and non-Christian. And that would equal civilized and non-civilized, human and non-human. And that it's in some ways before a sort of like evolutionary or development kind of model of human development, but rather one of conversion, of place, of like ontology of what it means to be a human. So I'll pause there, but I'm happy to come back and talk more about any of these things.
Thank you so much. There's some in the chat. GJ wrote, perfection is a colonial construct, and Erica said, yes, living with tensions and being open about them is so powerful. And Lucy has now said, I love your point of not applying contemporary geographically specific terms to the past. It has been a real theme. I was actually going to say, I'm going to encourage people, we have time for another question if they want, if people want to post. But Leah said something that I talk about a lot with my students, and I just love the sort of sharpness that you put on it. The past is super weird. The disorientation is really what allows us to grasp the radical possibility. And there's a way in which applying that to the early modern period, or the however you want to define this moment that you're talking about, is so powerful. And I think that early modernity, especially to people who do modern work, has that weird and monstrous appearance. I'm wondering what Erica and Lucy think about that. Like, the past, even the most immediate past, is super weird. And we sometimes don't let it live that way because we want it to get resolved, or because I study the history of HIV. There's so much data, right? And you think that you're looking for a needle in the haystack, but actually the haystack's super messy. And whereas in early modernity, you're looking at shards of things, right? You have 5 images that you're able to do. So I'm wondering, Lucy and Erica, if you want to take up that question of the past is super weird, and ways of looking at our recent past in ways that disorient us.
Yeah, to speak to
question to you.
To speak to that a little bit. So this novel is from 1987. It's not that long ago, but a lot of students were not born yet. And even me, I was very young at that time. So, looking at the past is different. And then that book itself looks further past. I think it's important, and I really appreciated Gayatri's presentation for this reason, to connect it to real life people. Real life people. Cliff doesn't do a good job of connecting to indigenous populations or African Aboriginal practices that are in real life. She kind of looks at them as the past, and I think it's really important to see who are the people who are still around, who are the people who are still practicing those things, and what kind of connections can be made, what kind of lessons can be learned in that process. Because the past is weird. It's nice to understand it, but it also leaves a lot of space for us to imagine what the past was in ways that can be harmful, can be creative and wonderful at the same time. We get to pick and choose from the past, but who are we harming in the process? Who are we lifting up in the process? And try to be accountable to the communities who are around today, including sometimes being accountable to ourselves and the things that we as individuals need.
That's really beautiful, Erica. Lucy, do you want to comment, or should we move on? Whatever you like.
Maybe just very briefly, this is something that preoccupies me. And again, with teaching, I think the history of feminist thought gets taught in this very teleological way of like wave analogies. And a lot of my students, I think I would never, I'm about to step into extremely dangerous waters, but I think there's a tendency among my students to be really rigid around some of the concepts they use, and that I think is a safety thing, of like needing the safety of those things in an unpleasantly like cis het world. But I think in the process of that, they're quick to write off a lot of older work and read it in particular frameworks that I think is very ungenerous to it, and lose it, and means that they lose some awesome ideas. Like some of the stuff I've only just read, like Firestone's Dialectic of Sex this last couple of years. I didn't read those classics because they weren't sexy and new, but they're freaking incredible. And I think it's such a shame to reduce them and caricature them in the way that they often are.
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to read this one question from Robin and then open it up to you, and let's see where we get. So Robin writes, I would love to hear Leah's thoughts about how the idea of non-binary as innocence, pre-lapsarian, which I had to look up, occurring before the fall, and deviance go together. A not very good Jew, obviously. Are they actually in tension, or were cultures outside of Europe seen as justifiably colonized because their non-binariness made them childlike or underdeveloped, as opposed to having properly developed into civilization, which of course raises a whole set of questions about how psychology has changed the way we think about human development. Anyway, Leah, maybe you'll think about that. Mark, do you want to ask your question quickly and we'll see where we get? Or you want to hold it?
Yeah, my question was one that I think could go maybe not necessarily addressed right this second, but maybe to think about in some of our other conversations. It struck me as Lucy was speaking, I was really struck by, Lucy, the way that you were talking about political action and coalitions and coalition building. And so much of the conversation that we've heard so far has been a critique of coalition building of a certain kind, and political action of a more or less functionalist and proceduralist kind. It really just really drove home for me hearing our students talk about a call for everyone to rethink gender identification, not just for building coalitions across the way in which many people, in a sort of liberal sense, liberal inclusivist sense, would come together and think about political action. No, it needs to come from the ground up. And so it was really to ask sort of where the thinkers you are taking us back to are on the map, but it's also just a question to think about as we keep talking about these issues.
I see Erica's typing, or was typing, an answer to Leslie. I'm going to ask Leah to comment, and then we can see if there's any time. Well, there won't be any time left. Leslie, we're going to have to deal with your question in another context. Please.
Okay, I'll just try to make this quick. Okay, so the idea that this is, yes, so prelapsarian means like before the fall of humanity, right? So this is like the original condition of like the Garden of Eden. And so, yes, in this strain of Christian and Jewish theology that I'm looking at, there is the imagination that that was a period before sex and gender. And then there's a related argument that after people die and they're resurrected, it's kind of the end of time and like people are back in paradise, that again, like gender disappears and people are without gender and completely undifferentiated. So I do think that this is kind of like what I want to say about utopian visions, you know, when people who are in this much earlier period are imagining like, what would a world look like that is perfect? They're in these cases imagining it as a world without gender, which I think is really significant to think about. However, you know, going to the point about things change over time, when you're looking at like, you know, 1200 years or so, the arc of like how this sort of period of time or place of no gender is received and imagined is highly differential. And so the same kind of idea of a place of no gender, if it's existing in Africa or in Asia, it can be sometimes viewed as like a paradise, a place of freedom, a place of like desire, and sometimes of like erotic or pornographic desire in some of these images. But also it can be a place that is absolutely dehumanized, is absolutely treated in a derogatory way, and is absolutely a place that is then the target of correction, of European correction, of European imposition of like Christian roles and societal values that we see like in adherence to a binary model. So I think that those things are actually are actually more complementary and more interrelated than they might at first seem. But it does speak to a very different sorts of ideas of what a world without gender mean across time in different kinds of contexts.
I think that really sets up perfectly the end. And I just encourage people to look at the answers that Lucy and Erica have posted to Leslie's question, which I think fits really well with what we just heard. And there is somebody who's asking if it's possible for everyone to see the chat. I think people were hoping that things would live in the Q&A, but of course, does that mean I win Zoom bingo again, Lucy, for recognizing that and even being able to call it out? Okay, then having just won the Zoom bingo, I want to thank our panelists today for a really incredibly rich and beautiful conversation. And I'm so grateful that we all got to hear it and experience it together. And I encourage people to take a break. I encourage Lucy to go to sleep, and we'll see you at 2:00.